The presentation of Anarchism as social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race. The emancipation.
Anarchist Essays is brought to you by Loughborough University's Anarchism Research Group. For more information on the ARG, see the link in the show notes or follow us on Twitter at ARGLBORO.
To Save the Saviours, Reorganizing Anarchist Solidarity in Europe After World War II by Maria Chomard. In 1945, Europe was a continent of survivors. Cities lay in ruins, borders had shifted, and millions of people were displaced. Rebuilding was not only a matter of bricks and institutions, it was also a matter of reconnecting people. Families searched for relatives who had vanished into camps or exile. Political movements attempted to reassemble after years of repression and clandestinity. Across the continent, survivors faced the task of rebuilding lives in societies profoundly altered by war, genocide, and occupation. Many post-war histories have focused on governments, international organizations, and large humanitarian agencies. These actors undeniably shaped the reconstruction of Europe, but alongside them existed smaller, informal networks, fragile, understudied, and often politically marginal, that also played a role in reconnecting people across borders. My contribution to the volume Practices of Reunification, the Continuation of Refugee Life after 1945, edited by Susanne Korbel and Philip Strobl and recently published by Routledge, aims to tell the story of one such network, the transatlantic anarchist mutual aid movement after World War II. This was a movement made up of only a few dozen active individuals, most of them Jewish, many of them survivors. They attempted to save comrades, rebuild institutions, and re-establish an international anarchist movement after the devastation of war. Their mission was only partly successful, an outcome that eliminates both the limits of anarchist solidarity after the Holocaust and the growing tension between universalist political commitments and Jewish particularist forms of post-war relief. So, anarchist mutual aid did not originate after 1945. It developed in the early 20th century, particularly in response to political repression in the Russian Empire. Anarchist militants faced imprisonment, exile, and execution, prompting the creation of international aid networks that raised funds, sent material support, and maintained communication across borders. A key demographic feature of this movement was the high proportion of Jewish activists. By the early 20th century, nearly half of Russian anarchists were Jewish. These activists were radicalized by overlapping forms of oppression. They responded not only to political repression, but also to pervasive anti-Semitism, including pogroms, legal discrimination, and economic exclusion. As many migrated to Western Europe and North America, most notably the United States, they carried these experiences with them. There, they established transnational infrastructures of support, relief funds, committees, and newspapers often centered in metropoles such as London, New York, and Chicago. Importantly, these networks were not defined in ethnic terms. Even when Yiddish functioned as a shared language, solidarity was articulated as political rather than specifically Jewish. Aid was intended for anarchists, regardless of origin. This commitment to ethnic neutrality and cosmopolitanism remained central to anarchist self-understanding throughout the interwar period. Although Jewish culture and language shaped much of the movement's everyday practice, Jewishness, or Yiddishkeit, was rarely foregrounded as a principle of solidarity. The Holocaust fundamentally altered this context. During and after the war, at a time when the majority of surviving anarchists maintaining transnational connections were Jewish, the claim to ethnic neutrality became increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of genocide. The question was no longer theoretical. Could anarchist mutual aid remain universal after a catastrophe that had targeted specifically Jews? In the immediate post-war period, the center of anarchist relief activity shifted to the United States. European anarchist institutions had been dismantled, and communication across the Atlantic had been disrupted for years. American anarchists, by contrast, possessed relative stability, organizational continuity, and access to resources. Within the American movement, however, two competing approaches to mutual aid emerged. In Chicago, the Alexander Berkman Aid Fund defended the universalist model of solidarity. Aid, its leaders argued, should be distributed on the basis of political affiliation alone. Ethnic or religious prioritization was viewed as a dangerous concession that threatened anarchism's cosmopolitan foundations. In New York, particularly around the Yiddish anarchist newspaper Freie Arbeiterstimme, a different approach developed. Here, Jewish survival and Yiddish cultural continuity were increasingly central to relief efforts. This difference was shaped by context. New York's anarchist milieu was deeply embedded in the Jewish left and closely connected to broader Jewish relief institutions. The Holocaust had devastated the movement's readership, donors, and families. In 1945, this divergence became institutionalized with the creation of the Freiheitlicher Flüchtlingsfonds, or the Libertarian Refugee Fund, which prioritized Jewish anarchist refugees in Europe. While a practical compromise was reached between the Chicago and New York initiatives, dividing tasks and coordinating aid between the two institutions, the disagreement itself was not resolved. It reflected a deeper ideological tension between anarchist universalism and Jewish communal forms of postwar solidarity. This tension went on to reappear, this time on European soil. In Europe, post-war anarchist relief efforts were coordinated primarily from Paris. In late 1945, a small group of mostly Jewish anarchist survivors established the Paris Committee of the Berkman Fund. It became the only permanent European branch of the transatlantic anarchist aid network. At first, the committee embodied the promise of reunification, drawing on pre-war personal networks and new post-war connections. It coordinated appeals for assistance from across Europe. Its beneficiaries included Jewish survivors of Nazi camps, Spanish anarchist refugees from the Civil War, displaced persons in Germany, and political exiles from Eastern Europe. The committee attempted to uphold a cosmopolitan vision of solidarity under conditions of extreme scarcity. But this vision quickly encountered material limits. As the immediate post-war emergency faded, donations from the United States declined sharply. To survive institutionally, the Paris Committee increasingly relied on funding from organized Jewish relief institutions, in particular the Jewish Labor Committee across the Atlantic. The funding was directed primarily towards explicitly Jewish projects, in accordance with the latter's priorities, while cosmopolitan anarchist aid became structurally dependent on shrinking anarchist resources. As a result, solidarities that had coexisted uneasily up until that point on both sides of the Atlantic now pulled in different directions. Reunification became mediation, then mediation became fragmentation, causing the transatlantic aid network to effectively collapse by the late 1940s. This prism of mutual aid and its attempted reunification after the war, beyond being a fascinating fragment of anarchist history in its own right, is, I argue, fundamental to understanding the movement, at least in its institutionalized form. Indeed, it forces us to rethink what we mean by its crisis, long noted by historians but rarely linked directly to the Holocaust. While some have emphasized a much earlier decline, locating anarchism's eclipse before the First World War or during the interwar years, Others have, on the contrary, stressed long-term continuity, tracing anarchist values across generations despite organizational weakness often linked to ideological rigidity. What both approaches tend to miss, in my view, is the Holocaust and its aftermath as a structural rupture in anarchism's social and moral economy. A rupture that mattered precisely because anarchism was not a fixed or stagnant doctrine, but receptive to and heavily influenced by social change. Before the war, Jewishness had been structurally central, but ideologically muted within anarchism, at least as it pertained to its organized, transnational aspect. This balance allowed anarchists to maintain a universalist, mutual aid politics while relying on networks and resources that were in fact predominantly Jewish. The Holocaust made that balance untenable. After 1945, Jewish anarchists were no longer one group among others. They constituted the overwhelming majority of survivors, donors, and organizers. Universalism could no longer function as an abstract principle. It had to operate through bodies marked by genocide. Under these conditions, ethnic neutrality ceased to unify. Instead, it became a source of conflict. The tensions between Chicago and New York and between anarchists and Jewish relief organizations were not peripheral disputes. They were, in fact, the practical expression of a deeper problem: how to sustain anti-nationalist, universalist politics in a world reorganized around genocide, refugees, and communal reconstruction. Mutual aid became the arena in which this problem was negotiated, not in theory, but in decisions about funding, eligibility, and institutional alliances. Seen this way, anarchism's post-war fragmentation does not represent stagnation or failure to adapt. Rather, it reveals a movement in painful transformation, forced to confront the limits of its own ideals under conditions of extreme moral pressure. So, anarchist reunification after the Second World War failed, both structurally and politically. The post-war world, shaped by nationalism, Cold War politics, and the creation of the State of Israel, left little room for the old cosmopolitan network. Nevertheless, this ultimate failure is not the whole story. For several years, anarchist mutual aid saved lives, provided material assistance to hundreds of individuals, and temporarily restored transnational connections. More importantly, it exposed a central post-war dilemma: solidarity after genocide is never neutral. The attempt to save the Saviours thus reveals not only the fragility of minority political movements, but also the deep ideological fractures that the Holocaust made impossible to ignore. That perhaps is its most enduring lesson.
Thank you for listening. To help others find anarchist essays, please rate and review us wherever you find your podcasts. And if you're interested in anarchist ideas, why not check out the journal Anarchist Studies? For over 20 years, Anarchist Studies has been publishing original research on the history, theory, and practice of anarchism. For more information, visit www.lwbooks.co.uk/anarchist-studies.